Hello there, Audrey here, and welcome to another episode of the Photography Made Simple podcast. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. Now, one of the things that used to really confuse me when I first started learning photography was all the different camera lenses that were available and trying to figure out which lenses would work best for the photos I wanted to take. As we all know, lenses aren't exactly cheap, so we always want to make sure that we get the best lens for our genre and our style of photography. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about in this week's episode. I'm going to break down the 5 main types of camera lenses, what each one is typically used for, and how you can use it for different types of photography. If you're new to photography and this whole lens thing bamboozles you, I think you'll find this episode incredibly helpful. But even if you've been shooting for a while, maybe you're looking to add to your lens collection, then this will help give you some ideas of what's out there and what might be best for you to invest in next. Maybe you simply want to get a different look to your photos, even though you're planning on photographing the same subject. Or perhaps you want to try out a completely different type of photography and are wondering what lens you'll need. Either way, you'll get the answers in this podcast. Now, before we jump in, I do want to tell you about the free download that goes along with today's episode, which will help you see what you can do with some of the lenses we're going to talk about today. I think it's always really nice to see example photos taken at different types of lenses. So that freebie will show you some photos I've taken with my lenses so you can see what look they give, when you might want to use each one, and included in the freebie is some links to some lens suggestions too. You'll find a link to it at the show notes for this episode at livesnaplove.com/8 or around where you're listening to this podcast. So that's your freebie for today. Let's go ahead and dive in. Hey there, I'm Audrey-Anne, founder of Live Snap Love, and I'm on a mission to help photographers just like you grow their photography skills quickly and in a way that feels simple and easy so you can shorten the learning curve and get photos you love faster. I created this Photography Made Simple podcast to share simple, actionable techniques, helpful insights, and practical advice on all things photography. So if you're itching to take your photos to the next level, whatever that level may be, you're in the perfect place. So let's get started. So today we're talking about the 5 different types of camera lenses and what you can use each one for. But before we dive in, I want to quickly go over some basics because I know there is nothing worse than listening to something and only understanding half of it. So the first thing I want to say is that we're talking about types of lenses. But within each type, you usually have 2 different categories you can get them in: prime lenses and zoom lenses. So let's start by looking at prime lenses. Prime lenses have a fixed focal length, meaning they don't zoom in and they don't zoom out. So if you want to get closer or further away to your subject, you're going to have to physically move yourself closer or further back. So while prime lenses are less flexible due to that fixed focal length, they're also very fast, they're lightweight, and they're generally sharper than their zoom counterparts. Zooms, on the other hand, have a range of different focal lengths in a single lens, meaning you can zoom in and out to see less or more of the scene. You don't have to move yourself forward or further back. You can just turn the dial on your lens. This does make them more flexible than a prime lens. They can also be great if you only want one lens, and they can also be useful for shooting things like weddings or sports when you might need to get closer or further away from the action and can't necessarily move yourself and get up off of your seat to do it. The downsides to zooms is that for good quality zooms, they tend to be much more expensive. They're also usually heavier to carry and they don't have quite the same level of image quality as you would get from primes. Now, obviously, that is all relative. You can't expect $100 prime lens to compete with a $3,000 zoom lens, but if you have the same quality of lenses, generally the prime lenses will be of a higher image quality than the zoom. So when I talk about our types of lenses, remember that you can get most of these types in either a zoom or a prime. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is that when I talk about focal lengths for lenses, I'm talking about them in relation to full frame cameras. If you are shooting with a crop frame camera, remember that these will work slightly differently on your camera. Now, I'm not going to go into all that here, but I do have a blog post that goes into all of that in detail, so I'll link to that in the show notes too. Remember, you can find them at livesnaplove.com/8. So let's kick things off now with the first type of camera lens, and that is the standard lenses. Now, these are lenses that aim to give you roughly the same field of view as the naked eye. It's not exact, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. Basically, this means when you lift that camera to your eye, the scene won't look zoomed in or zoomed out. So it will look quite natural and have no or very little distortion. So standard lenses have a focal length somewhere around the 50mm mark. So anything really between 40mm and 60mm. The most common focal length for a standard lens with a prime is the one that falls slap bang in the middle of that, and that's the 50mm. For zoom lenses, they will have a range that includes 50mm and then one that is slightly shorter and then slightly longer. So that's usually somewhere in the 24 to 70mm mark. So that has 50 and then slightly shorter and slightly longer focal lengths. So when exactly would you use a standard lens? So a 50mm prime lens or a zoom that incorporates that focal length are usually great all-rounder lenses, mainly because they most closely mimic what we can see naturally. So you don't have to worry about it being the wrong lens for the job. So some concrete examples would be portraits, street photography, indoor photography, landscape photography, and newborn photography. Now, that doesn't mean that the 50mm focal length is the ideal lens for any of these types of photography. In fact, in most cases, you will get other lenses that can do all of the above types of photography better. But if you only want one lens that can adequately cover a full range of situations, then a standard lens is your best bet. So I really consider the 50mm to be an all-rounder lens. It's not the perfect lens for different situations by any means, but you can shoot a lot with it. So it's often considered a camera bag staple. And it's often one that is great to get when you don't have a lot of different lenses. So for example, if you're just starting out and you want one lens that can cover a wide variety of situations, then the 50mm can be a really good one to get. It can also be really useful if you want something that you can take with you that gives you lots of options from one lens. So for example, great to take on holidays, as you could take portraits with it, you can do some street photography, you can do a little bit of landscape. Pretty much it can cover a wide variety of situations. That being said, this is my personally least used lens. Just because over the years I've added to my lens collections, so I have better lenses for most situations. I still have it though because it's really easy to throw in your camera bag in case you need it. And as I say, as a walk-around lens, it's really light and small, so I tend to take it on holidays because it's such a great all-rounder. Okay, let's move on now to lens type number 2, which is telephoto lenses. Now, telephoto lenses have a longer focal length than standard lenses, and they magnify the subject, allowing you to take photos of subjects that are farther away. Generally, a lens is considered telephoto with a focal range above 60mm, but you can probably further categorize a telephoto range into mid-range telephoto, which is around 70 to 200, and then super telephoto, which is anything over 200, like a 300 or 400 millimeter. Essentially, once you get into paparazzi stalking territory. So when exactly would you use a telephoto lens? Well, because they can be quite cramped indoors, you are best to use a telephoto lens outside, especially when you have some distance between you and your subject that you need to bridge. They are also incredibly flattering for portraits, as they slim down the face just ever so slightly, and they give great background blur, which helps separate your subject from the background. So if you know those images that look like their subject is popping off the background, that's usually down to using a telephoto. You can also use these for times when you simply can't get too close to your subject, such as for shooting wildlife or sports. So here are some areas where a telephoto lens is pretty darn useful. So the first is portrait photography, particularly that mid-range telephoto. Wildlife photography, sports photography, useful for astronomy as well, and anywhere where you want to have that really dreamy background blur. As the focal length goes up, so does the weight and the size of the lens. So at the far end of that super telephoto range, you are definitely going to need to use a tripod, or at least seriously consider upping your gym workouts. As a result, they are definitely not that great for going on a long walkabout with, as they can get really heavy very quickly. And they can be cumbersome, especially if you have a zoom telephoto lens. So classic focal lengths in this category for prime lenses are 85, 135, 200, and then if you want to go ultra telephoto, 400 millimeter. And if you're looking at a zoom lens, you're looking at the 70 to 200 mark. So as I say, these type of telephoto lenses are ideal if you are a portrait photographer, and you can also use that for things like sports and wildlife. Don't forget as well that you can go and download that freebie, which gives you some examples taken with a 50mm, 85 and 135, so you can get an idea of how that changes the look and style of your image. You can get that at the show notes at livesnaplove.com/8. So let's move on now to our next category of lenses, which is wide angle lenses. So wide angle lenses are the exact opposite of telephoto lenses, as with these you can fit more into the frame than a standard lens. In other words, everything looks zoomed out and you can fit more into the frame. So the focal length for a wide angle is pretty much anything between around 16mm and 40mm. The smaller that focal length number, the more you will be able to fit into the frame. But also keep in mind that the more you fit in the frame, the more distortion you are likely to get. Now, because of the distortion you can get, really wide angles aren't particularly great for individual portraits, but they can be fab for group photos or for lifestyle or environmental shots. So when would you use a wide angle lens? So anytime you want to fit more into the frame, so when shooting inside, large group shots, or to include a whole landscape, or for an environmental portrait, they are all times when a wide angle is really useful. They also help give you a more inclusive feel to an image. In other words, where you want the viewer to feel as if they were standing right in the scene when they look at the photo. So here's some concrete examples of when you might want to use a wide angle. They're great for landscapes, for shooting interiors, large group photos, lifestyle and documentary style images because of that inclusive feel. Street photography as well helps you fit more into the frame and gives you that inclusive feel as well. And also for images of architecture. Now, as a general rule, if you go for a prime lens for your wide angle lens, they are also fairly small and lightweight. So they can also make a great walkabout lens as well, especially if you get something more in the 35mm region. So the prime lenses for these are usually 16, 24 or 35. And if you have a zoom lens for a wide angle, that's usually around the 16 to 35 millimeter. Now, if you are wondering about whether to get a 35 or a 50, especially if you like to shoot indoors and you maybe want to do some portraits, but you also want to do documentary style images, then I do have a blog post where I compare the two a lot more closely. I'll link to that again in the show notes. Moving on now, so we've covered standard lenses, which are somewhere between 40 and 60 millimeter, 50 millimeter being the standard. You have telephoto, which takes you from 70 millimeter to around 200 for mid-range. Further than that is usually classified as super telephoto. And then you have wide angle, which is anything between 60 and 40. And the wider the angle, remember, the more distortion that you get. So moving on now to the fourth type of lens, and that is a macro lens. Now, macro lenses are what you use for close-up photography. So they have a 1-to-1 ratio, which basically means they can capture your subject at life-size magnification. So if you want to capture the teeny tiny little details of a flower, or all the details of an insect, or water droplets or snowflakes, or details of anything else for that matter, then you're going to need a macro lens. Now, that doesn't mean that you can only use your macro lens for close-up photography. The longer focal length and the excellent sharpness also means that they take supremely beautiful portraits too. So my macro lens gets used for both portraits and macro in equal measures, making it a really good all-round purchase if you take portraits and macro, which is exactly what I keep telling my husband. So when would you use a macro lens? So if you want any type of detail shot, so details in nature, if you want that close-up of insects, you can also use it for portrait photography. Any type, as I say, of detail photography, for example, ring shots if you shoot weddings, and if you shoot newborns, it could also be really useful for taking photos of that teeny tiny toes or all the baby eyelashes. Again, anything where you want to really show the detail of something. Now, a macro lens is usually 100 millimeters, but you can also get 60 millimeter and 180 millimeter versions. Now, you don't normally get a zoom lens with a true macro function, so it's pretty much going to be a prime lens for this. Now, if you're interested in buying a macro lens, I have a blog post where you can learn more about macro lenses, how to choose one, and I also give you some cheaper suggestions in case you don't want to spend all of your money on a dedicated macro lens. Again, I'll link to that in the show notes. So let's move on now to our fifth and final category of lenses, and that is specialty lenses. So there are some more camera lenses that can give you a really unique look and feel to their photographs. And there are several types of this specialty camera lenses. And as the name suggests, they aren't your standard types of lenses, but they can be really fun to play with. So here's a couple of examples. The first is a fisheye lens. So a fisheye lens is an ultra wide angle lens that can usually take in a full 180 degree view. And that gives you a very distorted field of view, making what's in the frame look like it's inside a bubble. So these are used for indoor photos where you want the whole room to be squeezed into the frame, maybe like a bathroom. So often used in photos for selling your home when you need to take a whole image of a room, but it's very small and cramped. They can also be used as a fun lens though. So you can use that to take really interesting photos at the beach where you get it looking like what is in the frame is inside a bubble. They can also be used for fun and very quirky portraits. So, for example, they could be used to take fun kid portraits because they give that quirky kind of look to it, because anything that's in the center of the frame, like the face, is going to look larger and anything at the edges smaller. So it's really fun for distorting things Definitely not useful for standard portraits or any other type of standard image, for example. But anywhere where you want to cram quite a lot into the frame and don't mind the huge amount of distortion that you're going to get, as I say, things like landscapes or fun kid portraits, then you might find a fisheye something that you want to add to your camera bag. A second example of a specialty lens is a tilt shift lens. Now, a tilt shift distorts perspective, making things look smaller than they actually are, almost as if they are toys. You can also use them a lot in architectural photography, so you can get straight lines for your image. But they're also often used by other types of photographers, including portrait photographers, to get more creative photos. You can get lenses where you can get just a very tiny sliver of the frame in focus, and then this really unique bokeh effect in the out of focus areas. Now you get loads of different lenses that have different types of features. I personally want a lens baby, and that's maybe one that you've heard of, and you get different types of lens babies as well. I haven't decided which one I would like yet, which is why I've held off making the purchase, because again, they aren't cheap, so I want to make sure that I get the right one. I'll link to a couple of these in the show notes because we don't have example of those in the freebie that I mentioned earlier. So there you have it. That's the 5 main types of camera lenses and what you can use each one for. Now, I have lenses in nearly all of these categories, apart from the speciality, or at least not yet. So I have a 16 to 35 millimeter, I have my 35 millimeter, a 50, an 85, a 135, and a 200. So I use my 16 to 35 millimeter mainly for landscapes. My 35 millimeter I use mainly for indoor and lifestyle documentary style photos, also for group shots. As I say, I rarely use my 50 millimeter because I tend to use either my 35 or the one after it, which is the 85 millimeter, which I use for portraits. As I say, I keep the 50 millimeter because it can be useful to have in my bag for holidays because it's a great all-rounder when I don't want to take many lenses with me. The other ones I have is the 135 millimeter and the 200, and I use those both for portraits. They're actually quite similar in the look that they produce, so I intend to only keep one of those. So all that to say that I actually have too many lenses, so I intend to cut back on these. You definitely don't need the number of lenses I have, and you will find if you have that number, you won't use half of them on a day-to-day basis. So I bring this up because I don't want you buying lenses that you think you need that you're just not going to get a lot of use out of. Now I bring this up because I don't want you buying lenses that you think you need but you're not going to get a lot of use out of. We all get excited and want every single lens. This happens to all of us. It happened to me, and that's why I have more lenses than I need. So be very careful with the lenses you buy and make sure you need them rather than just want them. And try to get, especially if you're buying prime lenses, some gap between the focal lengths. I think having a 35, 50 and 85, the 50 becomes irrelevant, and having the 135 and the 200, one of those becomes irrelevant. So for me, something like a 35, 85, and 135 would probably give me everything that I needed. But choosing a lens is probably a whole topic for another episode, so I will leave that there for now. So thank you so very much for tuning in. I cannot wait to connect with you again next week, and I've got another jam-packed episode in store for you. And I will see you then. So that wraps up this week's episode of Photography Made Simple. I'll be back at the same time, same place next week. But if you want more, head on over to livesnaplove.com/podcast, where you can find all the resources and the downloads mentioned, plus a whole lot more. Finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, please be sure to subscribe, and that way you won't miss an episode. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you again next week.